Unquestionable discipline has always been considered the pati, fundamental and non-negotiable cornerstone of any armed force aiming for success and effectiveness in its operations and missions. In the absence of a solid and well-established disciplinary structure, the military organization inevitably disintegrates into a state of operational chaos and internal disorder, where the authority of the leadership is rapidly eroded and campaign strategies become mere theories, irrelevant in the face of confusion and insubordination. In the official, carefully constructed, and idealized narrative that President Vladimir Putin insists on projecting for the Russian army, discipline is presented not just as a requirement, but as an kotsumom, intrinsic national virtue, and a point of honor. He cultivates the image of soldiers who execute the orders of their superiors with an almost fanatical and unconditional obedience, ready to face any risk, including the sacrifice of their own lives on the battlefield, if so determined by the command. However, the harsh and relentless reality, unfolding in the theaters of operations, training bases, and Russian military facilities is diametrically opposed to this ideal. What is observed is an accelerated process of structural, moral, and psychological collapse, manifested by a growing wave of internal violence, logistical disorganization, and acts of retaliation that the Kremlin's high command has proven completely incapable of predicting, controlling, or even publicly admitting. The most forceful and dangerous retaliation against the war is not being delivered solely by the Ukrainian defense lines. It is being perpetrated by the Russian military personnel themselves, exposing a deep and festering wound in the morale, cohesion, and operational capacity of the armed forces. This internal crisis is not just a problem of morale, it is an existential threat to Russia's ability to sustain a prolonged war and to the stability of the regime, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The systemic failure to address these issues suggests a deeper rot at the very heart of the Russian military machine, one that threatens to consume it from within and destabilize the entire military structure. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, confident, cocky, and certain of a three-day victory. Kyiv will fall within 72 hours, they said. Russia's military was the world's second most powerful, or so we were told. The war, just a formality. 3 years later, Russia holds just 20% of Ukraine, and it has paid for it with nearly 1 million casualties, 1 million dead and wounded, more than the US suffered in 2 decades of the war on terror, compressed into just 3 years. And that's only the beginning of the disaster. At this crucial moment, before we deepen the analysis of the disintegration of the Russian victory narrative, we ask you to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. Your invaluable support with a like is essential for this in-depth investigation into the Russian military crisis to break through the barrier of misinformation and reach the largest possible number of viewers, ensuring that the truth behind the official narrative and propaganda is widely disseminated and debated. Today, we are dismantling the illusion that Russia is winning this war. We will analyze the territorial myths, the manpower crisis, the shattered economy, the propaganda, and the growing whispers that the Russian Federation itself may not survive the consequences of Putin's miscalculation. If you still believe the narrative that Russia has the upper hand, you will want to watch this video to the end. Let's start with the cold, brutal numbers. The Institute for the Study of Wars, ISW assessment from February 2022 states that Russia captured approximately 4,200 sq kilometers of Ukrainian territory last year, most of which was in the Donetsk area. This area is only slightly larger than Rhode Island, the smallest U.S. state by area. Comparatively, 4,200 square kilometers is around 0.6% of Ukraine's total territory size. And that's where the situation gets truly mind-boggling. Forbes did some independent number crunching using statistics from April 2025, where Russia only took around 68 square miles of territory. If Ukraine maintains that level of defenses and Russia doesn't step up on the offensive, the war in Ukraine would take another 230 years to end. That's how long Russia would need to occupy the entire country, one of the surefire ways to win. The same analysis suggested that Russia would need around 100 million casualties to achieve this, against its total 2025 population of around 144 million. This is far from a strategy. It's a complete absence of one, requiring a multi-generational investment in war, which brings about other severe issues. But territory only tells part of the story. Let's talk about the human cost of Russian President Vladimir Putin's imperial delusions. According to the latest data from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Russian forces have suffered approximately 975,000 casualties since February 2022. While we should approach any wartime statistics from Ukraine with caution, even conservative Western estimates from the UK Ministry of Defense put Russian casualties well above 750,000 at the end of last year. To put this in perspective, Russia lost approximately 15,000 soldiers during its 10-year war in Afghanistan. In just 3 years in Ukraine, they've suffered casualties overlapping 60 times higher. To put it bluntly, this is not a sustainable war effort. Russia's demographic crisis was already severe before the war, with a declining and aging population. The country's fertility rate was crippled by the economic crisis at the fall of the Soviet Union, reaching as low as 1.2 births per woman by the turn of the century. While the situation got slightly better, the country is still far below the replacement rate. As a result, there's a significant lack of working-age males younger than 30 poms, simply because they were never born. And Russia is also conscripting from that same lacking demographic. Now factor in not just the direct military losses, but also the estimated 20,000 Russians who have fled the country to avoid conscription. That's nearly 2 million working-age men removed from Russia's economy and society in just 3 years, beyond demographic shortages. In short, Russia is literally running out of people to throw into this meat grinder. To understand the extent of the tragedy that is likely going to befall Russia, let's roll back to the start of the invasion. Russian military planners were so confident they'd be celebrating in Kiev within days that they packed parade uniforms. Combat plans shared with troops indicated they should prepare for light resistance, followed by occupation duties. In fact, Russia's military logistics were structured around the assumption that Ukraine would collapse almost immediately. 3 years later, those assumptions looked not just wrong but delusional. Instead of a swift victory parade, Russia got bogged down in the longest conventional war in Europe since World War II. Their vaunted air force failed to establish air superiority. Their tank forces were decimated by portable anti-tank weapons and drones. Their elite units suffered catastrophic losses in the early phases, forcing Russia to resort to poorly trained conscripts, convicts, and foreign mercenaries. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, published a damning report in September 2024 titled The Russia-Ukraine War, a Study in Analytic Failure. The conclusion was that Russia's military planning represented perhaps the most significant intelligence failure of the 21st century. This sentiment was shared by the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI, which posited that Russia forewent its traditional logistical channels due to the erroneous belief that the war wouldn't last more than a few weeks. In short, Putin maintained the illusion that Russia was a great military force, but the military didn't have the planning or logistics to back that illusion up. Due to the secrecy behind the plans involved in the invasion, many higher officers were caught unaware of the true extent of the invasion and failed to properly stock up on supplies before the war began in earnest. This led to severe supply shortages in the crucial first few months of the war when Russia maintained the initiative. After the initial rebuttal at the Hostomel airport, which was essentially Russia's Hail Mary to conquer Ukraine with minimal losses, Russia failed to properly follow up, with a significant lack of adaptability that has become a necessity in modern warfare. Soon enough, Ukraine took back most of the territory it lost to the initial invasion, and the conflict devolved into one of attrition. Russian propaganda channels still peddled the idea that the war is a foregone conclusion, celebrating minor tactical gains of a few square kilometers. But in truth, Russia is losing a war to itself by running out of money to fund the war effort. On paper, Russia retains the 11th spot on the list of the world's largest economies, but strip back the veneer, and the situation is problematic at best. Western sanctions have decimated Russia's high-tech sectors, crippled its banking system, and isolated it from global markets. By the end of 2024, the ruble had lost 23% of its value against the US dollar, with the exchange rate between the two currencies fluctuating daily to create incomprehensible uncertainty about the country's real economic status. But the most devastating economic impact comes from Russia's pivot to a war economy. According to an analysis by Medusa, Russia now spends an estimated 140% of its governmental budget on defense, a level unsustainable for any modern economy. Worse yet, a third of it is hidden under secret projects related to the military-industrial complex, indicating an unprecedented level of propaganda and paranoia surrounding the Kremlin. What makes this situation even more dire is that Russia's primary source of income, energy exports, faces long-term decline. The European Union has reduced its dependence on Russian gas by over 30% since 2022. and oil sales to China and India are being negotiated at steep discounts. The dependence on oil and gas, which constitutes between 30 and 50% of the government's revenue, means that the country's already lacking workforce is increasingly turning to the one single profitable industry, the energy sector. This makes Russian manufacturing increasingly rely on imports, especially from China, and the entire country needing to import the workforce to meet its increasing demands. With Russia losing both militarily and economically, it has few options beyond simply continuing as is and accepting that war is the new status quo. None of them are good. Option 1, but not likely to happen, is a massive escalation. Some hardliners in the Kremlin have pushed for using pretty much everything Russia has to win the war, going so far as to propose the use of tactical nuclear weapons. This wouldn't be the first mention of nuclear warfare, as Putin himself has saber-rattled on the topic more than 24 times. But this scenario would ultimately backfire. While a limited nuclear deployment, such as destroying Kyiv or vital military sites, might create short-term tactical advantages, NATO would be basically hard-pressed to answer with nuclear weapons of their own. In response, Russia would need to use its supplies of weapons on NATO countries, plunging most of the world into a nuclear winter. And even that escalation wouldn't solve Russia's core problems. Russia desperately needs both the land and the people in Ukraine. Bombing them to oblivion makes the region uninhabitable, and the country would lose the potential 40 million citizens who would be used to prop up the failing demographics and workforce instead of resorting to immigration. The second option is withdrawing from Ukraine. Russia would likely only use this as a last resort, as it represents a devastating political defeat for Putin's regime, which has staked its legitimacy on this war. A withdrawal from Ukraine without achieving core war aims would likely trigger elite fragmentation within Russia and potentially regime collapse. Putin's government is a carefully built house of cards, hinging on the fact that Putin has been able to get what he wants for the past 2 decades. Annexing Crimea and fueling discourse within NATO have been key geopolitical wins for the Russian president. If the situation turns around, it will send a clear signal that the country's top echelon of government is actually not nearly as powerful as it seems. This explains why, despite catastrophic losses, Russia continues to pour resources into this conflict. The alternative, admitting defeat, is viewed as an existential threat to the current power structure. The third option is a peace deal, even in a limited form. While this might seem most rational after 3 years of basically trench warfare with drones, no side can reach an agreement on it. First, Ukraine has little incentive to negotiate away territory after successfully defending its sovereignty for 3 years. President Volodymyr Zelensky's peace proposal demands full territorial restoration, possibly including Crimea, as well as security guarantees from NATO. Even if Ukraine cedes territory, Zelensky has put NATO reassurance as one of his top priorities, even if he needs to step down as president in the process. Russia, meanwhile, cannot accept any agreement that doesn't legitimize its territorial conquests. And international geopolitics and relations are further complicating the matters. President Donald Trump's administration's erratic approach to Ukraine undermined consistent diplomacy. In February 2025, Trump met directly with Zelensky to propose a peace plan that would have ceded significant Ukrainian territory to Russia, contradicting the stated position of his own State Department. This caused a near-complete breakdown in relations between the two countries, ultimately resulting in a stalemate between the warring parties. Worse yet, Russia has publicly stated, multiple times at that it wants to find a peaceful solution, going so far as to accept probationary ceasefires. None of them worked, with the 30-hour Easter ceasefire resulting in Ukraine claiming Russia broke it nearly 3,000 times. Therefore, Russia is caught in a strategic trap of its own making, unable to win militarily, unwilling to accept defeat, and incapable of pursuing a diplomatic solution. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. What has Russia actually achieved through this catastrophic military adventure? Before the invasion, NATO was an alliance searching for purpose, with many questioning its relevance in the post-Cold War world. Trump himself criticized the alliance, as most members failed to meet the basic requirement of using 2% of their GDP on military. Today, it's revitalized and expanded, with Finland and Sweden as new members. The 800-mile border between Finland and Russia practically doubled the NATO-Russia border, significantly curbing Russia's ability to actually defend itself in a theoretical conflict against the economically larger, demographically stronger, and militarily more modern alliance. Specifically, the biggest changes came to countries that can hold large sway in the alliance. Germany, one of the world's largest economies, instituted new funding incentives for national defense. Poland, which was once a member of the Warsaw Pact, plans to create the largest standing army in Europe. Sweden and Finland have pushed their military-industrial complexes to the limit, sending prototypes of vital equipment to Ukraine and partnering with the US and UK contractors to deliver deadlier weapons. Diplomatically, Russia has transformed from a respected, if difficult, global power into a pariah state with limited international options. Russia's largest trading partner switched from the EU to China, a country that is even more dependent on resources and can significantly undermine Russian policies to get access to them. All of these issues came from a single problem that Russia failed to account for: the glaring gap between its projected military power and actual combat performance. Before February 2022, Russia's military was widely considered the world's second most formidable fighting force. Military analysts routinely cited its 1,320,000 active duty personnel, 2 million reservists, 6,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft as evidence of overwhelming strength. Annual military parades showcased supposedly cutting-edge equipment like the T-14 Armata tank, Su-57 stealth fighter, and hypersonic missiles. The Global Firepower Index consistently ranked Russia second, only to the United States. Western military planners built entire defense strategies around countering this perceived threat. And when the second-largest military invaded a smaller neighbor, it turned out none of the statistics really mattered. Instead of the feared Russian colossus, we saw elite paratroopers dropped into hostile airport without proper support, resulting in a complete failure to establish the air tunnel necessary to win the invasion. 40-mile-long armored columns running out of fuel just miles from their own borders. Tanks deployed without infantry support, making them easy prey for Ukrainian anti-tank teams. Russia resorting to human wave attacks, a tactic considered fit for World War I. Logistics trucks with commercial tires that failed in off-road conditions. Aircraft unable to effectively suppress Ukrainian air defenses. Museum pieces like the T-62, T-55, and possibly even the T-34, from all the way back during World War II, making their way to the front line. Perhaps most damning was the so-called modern equipment itself. Those supposedly advanced T-90M tanks, many were found with what should have been reactive armor blocks filled with sand and cement instead of explosives. The feared attack helicopters and fighter jets, plagued by navigation systems so unreliable that pilots taped commercial GPS units to their dashboards. And what about those next-generation weapons that cause so much concern in Western defense circles? The T-14 Armata tanks made a brief appearance in 2023 before being withdrawn. They either failed miserably or were too expensive to get blown up by cheap drones. The Su-57 stealth fighters have conducted only limited strike missions from safe distances within Russian airspace, lobbing glide bombs, the one saving grace of Russian military tactics, which also harken back to its Cold War weapon stores. But how could Russia's military leadership so catastrophically misjudge both their own capabilities and Ukrainian resistance? The answer reveals something fundamental about Putin's Russia. Russian intelligence services believed that Ukrainian forces would immediately collapse, and that most Ukrainians would welcome Russian troops as liberators. This wasn't just a military miscalculation. It was a fundamental failure to understand reality, driven by the very propaganda machine Putin had created to maintain his grip on power. One of the fatal flaws of the authoritarian regime that Putin created in Russia is that it completely depends on Putin's image as a leader. Brookings maintained that this is only tenable so long as the autocrat stays in power, which can severely damage the longevity of the country as a whole. Former Kremlin advisor Gleb Pavlovsky, now in exile, explained it more bluntly in his April 2022 interview. This is all Putin's own personal decision. Nobody, including myself, realized just how maniacally obsessed he must have been with Ukraine. We underestimated the extent of decay of the Russian government. Remember, this interview was only a month and a half into the invasion, and the same sentiment rings true 3 years later. The Russian military itself became a victim of this distorted reality. Corruption was endemic but hidden from official reports. Training exercises were choreographed performances rather than realistic preparations. Equipment maintenance existed on paper, while actual hardware deteriorated in storage. This is underscored by a closer examination of Russia's military doctrine. As a holdover from Soviet times, Russia's perceived biggest risk was a NATO invasion. To that end, Russia created operations and strategies to defend the motherland rather than invade. Its concentrated command structure would help it shore up weaknesses in defenses, but it also opened itself up to rampant corruption and power reshuffling once Putin came into power. With Russia losing momentum, there's a possibility that Putin himself could be ousted from the Russian throne. After all, he would be quickly found solely responsible for the disaster, and power-hungry politicians in the Kremlin would need to save face by removing him. However, Brookings succinctly analyzed that Russia's current political structure doesn't really have a viable candidate to succeed him, and that the entire regime might not survive a leadership change. This opens up a chance that Russia itself could collapse. This would happen in a few stages, but they would progress rather quickly or even coincide with one another. 1. First, there's the economic breakdown. Russia's war economy is already showing severe strain, with defense spending crowding out essential services. As casualties mount and sanctions bite deeper, this becomes unsustainable. Critical infrastructure, already suffering from underinvestment, begins to fail more frequently. 2. Second, political fragmentation. Regional governors, especially in resource-rich areas like the Far East, begin asserting greater autonomy from Moscow. Initially presented as an economic necessity, these moves gradually acquire political dimensions. 3. Third, military disintegration. As the professional army is ground down in Ukraine, Russia increasingly relies on poorly trained conscripts and ethnic minorities from peripheral regions. Unit cohesion breaks down. Desertion rates skyrocket. Military equipment fails without replacement parts. 4. Finally, the central authority collapses. Whether through palace coup, popular uprising, or simply the inability to project power to Russia's vast regions, the Moscow government loses effective control over significant portions of Russian territory. The consequences would be catastrophic, and not just for Russia but for global security. The Federation would likely collapse into a series of states, resembling the breakup of Yugoslavia or the fall of the Soviet Union itself in the 1990s. The core of the country, Moscow and St. Petersburg, would likely attempt to relocate Russia's nuclear weapon reserves and proclaim itself the successor state, saber-rattling with the arsenal much like Putin did during the war. Scores of immigrants would try to enter the EU again, going after the successes seen by former Warsaw Pact members like Romania and Poland. China might swoop in and occupy swaths of resource-rich territory in Siberia to fuel its bottomless industry. So the next time someone confidently tells you that Russia is winning in Ukraine, you just need to go back to the beginning. After 3 years of what was supposed to be a war that lasted a few days, Russia controls just 20% of Ukraine, has suffered casualties approaching 1 million, has devastated its economy, destroyed its international standing, reinvigorated its adversaries, and has no viable path to actual victory. The truth is that Russia isn't winning. It's trapped in a strategic disaster entirely of its own making, with no good options and no clear exit. The longer this war continues, the more catastrophic the consequences will be for Russia itself. But what do you think about this scenario? Leave your opinion and analysis in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you like this in-depth analysis, please leave your like and share this video with your friends and on your social media. Your support helps us continue to bring the truth behind the headlines. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss our next investigations. The future of global stability hinges on understanding these internal dynamics. Comment and share.